Let me click 1 second. Oh, I lost my mouse. Sorry guys. Oh, I think I have to, hold on, sorry, 1 second. When I was in play mode, I lost my mouse. So I wanted to click to make sure it could be recorded. About 4 years ago, I graduated from CSU Channel Islands. And that was my first experience diving in the kelp forest. But right before that, I had found a fascination in seaweeds and kelp visiting Santa Rosa Island, one of the more northern Channel Islands in this Southern California bight. If you guys have been out there, you probably also share how amazing this place is. And if you haven't, definitely go on a camping trip, a day trip. It's an incredible place to be. And I remember picking up on the beach all these different forms of seaweeds, from Turkish towel to laminaria to all these different textures and these intricate details that you can see in the seaweed. And I think that's really where people like Josephine Tilden and early female scientists, some of the very first, found this passion for seaweed, is that there's just so much versatility, so much diversity in just this one type of thing that lives on Earth, with this thing being algae, and being a source of all plant life on Earth. And I think about that connection to the ocean a lot when I'm creating my work. And so I came back from the Channel Islands when I was in undergrad, and I was finishing up, and I said, I really want to do something that can represent how diverse and interesting seaweeds are. So I was picking up in the kelp rack, I was picking up the seaweeds and kind of jiggling them and seeing how they flow. And this was just an observation from on the shore. And so I was taking these blades of seaweed, these single blades, not the entire plant, and trying to make these representations of the movement that seaweed has. So the movement of seaweed, I think, was one of the very first times that I looked at seaweed and said, wow, this is incredible. The way that this is moving, the way that the light shines through it. And so I made these representative sculptures that were woven with marine debris that were collected on the Channel Islands. So at that same time in 2018, I started helping out with a friend who had a grant from NOAA to do marine debris cleanups. And so I created a lot of these marine debris rope sculptures as a consequence of being out on the Channel Islands so much. It seemed like second nature to do something and upcycle all this waste that was being collected, and also to consider how this excess of waste and this a lot of commercial fishing industry, a lot of this waste being derelict fishing gear, how all of these different parts and systems are cooperating or going against one another, and what that plays like how that plays out in the kelp forest, how everything is connected. So through those first 3 years, I was just weaving all the time, spending 100+ hours on each one of these sculptures, weaving until my fingers had just these little hangnails all over them. What are like such a rough, frayed plastic material that I was working with, but also this obsession and admiration for in representing the different forms of seaweeds. So some of the later pieces that I had created to represent seaweeds were Nereocystis, which is this one on the right here that has the blades hanging off the ceiling. And then the other one slumping down is a split cyst, which is supposed to represent a macrocystis that had its blade torn off and it's kind of fraying and decaying. So kind of thinking of these two different contrasts between a healthy kelp forest and an unhealthy one, and what it looks like for something to be degraded and what that means for that system. Here are a couple other photos. And there's also macrocystis, periphery. Here are the holdfasts. So for the holdfasts themselves, I took some creative liberty to take the casts, the hand casts of different scientists working out on the Channel Islands. And naturally, this plaster material crumpled very easily, but I thought this was kind of telling of these torn apart connections that we have with marine ecosystems and how we can rebuild that and rethink about it. Another important player in this kelp forest, another project that I worked on obsessively over quarantine, was making as many little, I call them tomato urchin belly buttons. If it doesn't make sense to you, it's totally fine. It's the imagination of an artist that had a lot of liberties in this. But being in quarantine and being stuck at home and needing to play with something tactile and have clay and work with it and create these little pinch pots every single day. throughout quarantine. It really helped me while I was listening to podcasts and listening to what's happening in the kelp forest, think about this massive surgence in urchin barrens and how these dynamics are shifting, and what that means and how it can be portrayed artistically. And that's actually an ongoing installation for a while now, made tons of these, still looking to install this. Another part of my process in creating art is going to scientists, meeting with researchers, and understanding what they've been talking about and asking questions towards in the kelp forest. So I came up with this long list of questions that I had personally not founded on any other basis other than I just have curiosity for these questions, and I want to hear from researchers what they are interested in the kelp forest. And so to visualize the kelp forest and create these sculptures, there's a lot of research that goes behind it. Over quarantine, I sat with 7 different scientists and researchers. I traveled up the coast, up to Central California, and stopped along the way in parks to do socially distanced interviews. Some of them were online, some of them were recorded in person. And I asked them all the same questions because I wanted to see how different researchers, how different people are approaching the idea of kelp forests and what it means to them. So some of them are scientists, but some of them are also managers for the commercial fishing industry, and these different ways of thinking about the benefits of this ecosystem, the recreation of this ecosystem, and change inside of it. So what is the kelp forest in your mind? Can you describe the kelp forest in your own words? These kind of ways of thinking of the kelp forest. Also, one of the questions I asked, like, how can you describe the kelp forest without using ecosystem, the words ecosystem, the word kelp, forest, like what really is this place, and how can we engage people to have compassion for this place, and how can that be created through art and science? Even more questions emerged, and as I continued, some of the ending questions were, well, what questions as a researcher do you have for your colleagues that are also studying kelp forests? And so I started to add questions towards the end, and I saw this repetition and pattern of a lot of people looking towards the future. So at the end of this talk, and I don't know if this was guided by myself, very possible, at the end of this talk and interviews that I had with people, everyone wanted to know, well, what's in store for the future? What does it look like if the kelp forest disappeared? What would that look like for our culture? What would it look like for children, grandchildren later down the line, who can't maybe have that same connection to the kelp forest? So what's really important here? Is it, preserving services? Is it preserving it for the sake of preserving it? So there were some really interesting conversations that came about in this process. Another thing in my work is that I want to integrate art and science very directly sometimes, and other times very abstractly. So as an artist, I take the liberty to really kind of work on the data that's given to me and interpret it in my own way, and hopefully find different ways of interpreting it through my conversations. So I think it's an opportunity for scientists to look at, if I'm working with a data set from a scientist, for them to see their work through an artistic lens, and then for me to see, to have my work be molded and transformed by science. And I think this is really kind of the moment that really excites me in creating art. So this was, when I started in grad school. So I don't know if I mentioned earlier, right now I'm at UCLA, and I'm a graduate student at Design Media Arts Department. And I've split my time between South and North Campus because I just can't stay away from sciences in my practice. So this was one piece that I had done with processing. It might seem really abstract and digitized, but I was taking the data sets from a marine debris survey that was done on Channel Islands, and using different colors and different widths and all the numbers inside the data to create visuals. And this is the direction that I've been kind of pushing towards, is how can I use the science directly. And one of the projects that I'm working on right now with Siobhan from Molecular Biology Department is looking at the DNA sequences of seaweeds and hopefully turning that into a weaving pattern. So even though this is a digital version of an illustration of data, I want to see how, how can you code data and then have it turn into a weaving, and vice versa. So how we can think about these zeros and ones of coding. So how technology from early technology of weaving to later technologies of coding, how science and art have always kind of been alongside one another through history. As I mentioned, Siobhan and I were doing this DNA extraction of dried seaweed samples, which was really exciting. One of the first times actually that I'd been on campus after quarantine. We took these old Macrocystis perfora and fucus, I think disticus samples from Tanya Kane. She's the marine botany professor at UCLA. So we took these samples. So we took a little piece of it and we crushed them up, put them through the centrifuge, tried to melt them with the liquid nitrogen. And this was a very exciting experience for me, not having done a DNA extraction before, not coming from a background of science. So I took lots of photos and the process was very interesting, how many steps there were. And for the lack of better words, here's the goopy kelp slosh after centrifuging it maybe 100 times, it felt like. And with this, we saved the sample. It's currently in the freezer. We took we had nano drop testing, and we have the nanograms of possible DNA inside of this teeny tiny sample. This was really incredible. And with these numbers, we hope to get out the sequence for the heat shock proteins to see, what different species are, if they're turned on in different species, if they're reacting to climate change better, or they could possibly adapt differently. And so even though we're not going to get maybe solid scientific results, I hope that we can visualize what some of these sequences look like through weaving patterns and through coding. Some of the inquiries that I have in my practice, I have many when it comes, they're all around kelp, first of all. But if it's kelp, then I have a question about it, and it's going to be different every single time. One of the ones this year that I focused on a lot, especially through conversations with Siobhan, was the materiality of kelp. Its fragility, flexibility, can it be hydrated? Can it be used for art? Has it been used for art in the past, for basket making? I've been thinking of the genetics of kelp with this past project and now continuing on. So what patterns can be woven with DNA sequences, and why does that matter? How does visualizing these otherwise invisible patterns help us understand our connection to seaweeds? The visualization of kelp forests, its dynamics and its ecosystem services, or in other ways, like how are we a part of this marine ecosystem? Just because we don't live inside the kelp forest, we can't breathe through water, doesn't mean that we're not on our boats on top of it every single day. So how can we create that connection? Thinking from below perspectives and above perspectives, how can scientific surveys, mapping, and 3D modeling all help inform people what's happening with the kelp forests and why to care about it? So the other large thing is sharing stories of the kelp forests through interviews, through surveys. How is this our home? And conversations, of course, as always with scientists, to build these connections between technology, innovation, and culture. As Mara mentioned, I'd spent a lot of time this year in Oregon hiding in a little cabin during quarantine. Now, like looking in retrospect, it seems like I had quite a productive art quarantine thing that happened, but it was quite miserable as for everybody else being trapped in quarantine, but there was things that could come out of it. So I found a cabin in Oregon after doing a residency, and I'd stayed there for 4.5 months, which just the time flew by so quickly, but I found myself stuck there because of the Nereocystis leuciana. And the first time I saw it on the beach, it just looked like something otherworldly. I had, of course, seen it a couple times underwater in California, but not as much in Southern California as in Central and higher up north. And I had been reading about how the crash of the kelp forest was particularly affecting this species of algae. And so that was why it was kind of this thing that I wanted to represent in my art. And after all those years of working with plastics, and I still have a passion to work with it, I really wanted to touch something organic and to work with the kelp itself and see what it was doing and see if it can be woven with how does it work? How does how does it behave essentially, even after it's been dehydrated? What are the different ways of manipulating that? And so I came home with some stinky kelp in my car, and I took it into the cabin, and I said, okay, what can I wrap it around? um, I'm not gonna like wrap it around myself and then sleep and let the kelp dry. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to find something a little bit sturdier. So I took these buckets of kelp these buckets of just plastic buckets under the sink. I took even pots and pans sometimes, and I just wrapped the kelp around it, wove it so that it would stay in this circular way. And while I'm doing it, I realized too that the kelp wants to move in a certain way, right? So if you kind of go against the grain, or you kind of like a hose, if you do it the wrong way, it's gonna be all hell trying to get it unraveled and clean it up properly afterwards. So I started to learn how the kelp behaved just as it is, and how it wants to move. And so then after a few days, about 4 days from this photo, you can see that the kelp starts to dehydrate. And this happened very slowly. Of course, in Oregon, being very humid, there was a lot of rain. Sometimes it took weeks for them to dehydrate, and sometimes they just got moldy and gross, which was, and part of the natural process and understanding the kelp. And after it had dehydrated, I collected all these coils, took them off the buckets, and I did a survey. I reached out to people who might be interested in playing with kelp. And I sent out emails, and people responded. Some people had lots of experience weaving, and some people had a lot of people had very minimal experience. And I thought, this is great. I invited the researchers that I had done interviews with, like, this will be fun for them to play with some kelp. We talked about kelp. They work with kelp all the time. What does it mean to think of it in a different way? I was hoping to engage in this. In each package that I sent out to people, I gave them a few different things. So first they had a coiled wool kelp, and this is all for, by the way, this is the project for weaving threads that I did earlier this year. So there was a coiled wool kelp, a hydrated piece of wool kelp that I had preserved with a humectant, with glycerin, so that it would attract the moisture in the air. And this worked really well because you can't, of course, weave with something that doesn't want to bend and create tension. So creating tension is something to think of consciously when you're weaving. In addition to having these pieces of seaweed that I'd collected, hydrated, and dehydrated, I also wanted people to bring in something of their own into this. How can you, do this idea of relational aesthetics, have seaweed and have something of your own that you put into it. So I thought, okay, people must have like trash in their kitchen, right? Everybody has at some point some onion skins, avocado pits, maybe an old t-shirt that they're going to get rid of in their closet. And so I thought, let's incorporate some of these home materials. And let's also, just to keep going with the relational aesthetics theme, let's also incorporate some wool, something that I had gotten from Goth Farm Yarns. This was a small business that was sourcing sheep wool, and that was outside of this traditional merino wool, but inside of more like Navajo Churro sheep wool, Gotland farm sheep wool, all these this diversity of different materials to kind of, the whole point of this was really to think of biodiversity and cultural diversity as one and the same. So how can we think of these many different things as interconnected? Each person came back to the workshop that we had online with different materials from their home. Some people had eucalyptus, turnip weeds, so there were a lot of invasive plants that people had collected on walks around their home. And we created these dye baths to think of the pigments, think about extraction of pigments and materiality, and just this idea of colors. So this relates very closely to, histories of weaving, of creating with nature around us. There were many, many different colors in the outcome. And the idea was to kind of, to come back and culminate everything that had been going on over the last couple months with the workshops, with the dried seaweeds that were inside the cabin. And everybody wove their own piece of cloth into the kelp so that they're putting it together. And we hosted this as an online performance for a couple hours where everybody sat with the same materials and wove together. And in the beginning, we had listened to the interviews, and then towards the end, people were reflecting on the experience, talking about what it means to work with this material. One person said that thinking about the comments of the journey of these fibers or materials to get into our hands, it feels weird even to call them materials. These are other beings in different phases of their life or existence. There were many comments of people speculating what they're doing. Like, this feels really rigid working with the seaweed, but then this material is really like, feels like a gum, or how can these material observations or other being observations help inform how we understand the natural world? As a result, people sent their pieces to all be shown together in an exhibition. And it was incredible to be able to kind of pinpoint all these different colors of pigments that come from different creatures and how they work together as this single weaving, how it's this co-creation and collaboration with multiple beings, which is essentially what the kelp forest is. It's a space, it's a habitat where many things work together. Nothing is a singular organism functioning on its own, but it's always dynamic, and it's always in communication with everything else around it. And so that was the show that also had the piece on display. And the last part of this, and the last slide of my presentation, another scientist that I worked with is Ben Gottesman. So he has been collecting soundscapes from the Channel Islands to show biodiversity through sound. So I'm really curious in my practice how all these different conventions of looking at the same thing help inform how we connect to place, how we connect to the kelp forest. So whether it's through sound, whether it's through touching kelp, feeling other materials with kelp, or just sharing stories about kelp, I think it's so important that we can all find ourselves grounded to the kelp forests and understand that it is very much an ecosystem that we are a part of, that we live with every single day, that we interact with all the time. And yes, thank you so much for listening. Does anybody have questions?